September 17, 1943, Boston Harbor. The autumn wind carried the smell of salt and diesel as Marco Tessari descended the gangway of the transport ship USS Henderson, his legs unsteady after 3 weeks crossing the Atlantic in the bowels of a converted cargo vessel. Behind him, nearly 2,000 Italian prisoners moved in a shuffling line, their worn uniforms still bearing the dust of North African battlefields where Mussolini's dreams had crumbled into surrender. They had been told to expect labor camps in frozen wastelands, punishment details in desert work gangs, maybe worse. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. What Marco didn't expect was the Red Cross volunteer at the dock who handed him a sandwich wrapped in wax paper, roast beef on white bread with yellow mustard, more meat in one meal than he'd seen in the last 6 months of fighting. The woman smiled at him, her gray hair pinned beneath a volunteer's cap, and said something in English he couldn't understand. But her eyes held no hatred, no contempt, just a grandmother's kindness that made his throat tighten with unexpected emotion. The buses that carried them inland weren't the prison trucks they'd imagined. They were standard passenger coaches with windows that actually opened, seats with cushions that hadn't been torn apart, and a driver who whistled popular tunes as he navigated through the Massachusetts countryside. Marco pressed his face against the cool glass, watching America reveal itself in ways that made everything he'd been told seem like children's stories. The factory stretched for miles, smokestacks pumping steady streams into the autumn sky, production lines that never seemed to stop. His unit had fought with rifles that jammed, artillery shells that failed to explode, trucks that broke down daily because there were no replacement parts. Here, he watched workers park automobiles outside factory gates, personal vehicles for common laborers, each one newer and shinier than any car he'd seen in Italy outside of Rome's wealthiest districts. The propaganda officers back in Sicily had painted America as a nation on the brink of collapse, weakened by racial divisions, crippled by economic depression, soft from decades of peace and prosperity. They said American soldiers couldn't fight, that American industry was a paper tiger, that American resolve would crumble at the first real test. Marco had believed them because he'd wanted to believe them, because the alternative was too terrifying to contemplate. Now, watching endless fields of corn taller than a man, silos that could hold more grain than his entire village produced in a decade, barns with electric lights blazing in broad daylight, he felt the first tremors of understanding that Italy had never stood a chance. The train depot in Albany, New York, served as a transfer point where prisoners were sorted by trade and skill. A bored corporal with a clipboard worked his way down the line, asking questions through an interpreter who spoke Italian with a thick Sicilian accent. When he reached Marco, the interpreter paused at his response. "You're a baker?" The man's eyebrows rose slightly. "Trained where?" Marco explained about his family's bakery in Verona, 3 generations of Tessaris who had supplied bread to half the city, his apprenticeship that began at age 7, the techniques passed down from his grandfather who had learned from his grandfather. The corporal made a note, circled something on his papers, and moved on. Marco didn't know it yet, but that simple exchange had just changed the trajectory of his life. The prisoner processing center at Fort Devens operated with mechanical efficiency that astounded the Italians. Within 4 hours, Marco had been photographed, fingerprinted, medically examined, deloused, issued new clothes, and assigned a prisoner number. The clothes weren't military uniforms, but work denims, sturdy blue fabric with copper rivets, the kind of practical garments that would last for years. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel, it means a lot to us. Now back to the story. The boots were new. Leather that hadn't been recycled from corpses or patched together from scraps. Each man received toiletries in quantities that seemed excessive, bars of soap that smelled like pine forests, toothbrushes with actual bristles, razor blades that were sharp and new. The medical examination revealed what Marco already knew. He was malnourished, underweight, suffering from chronic dehydration and vitamin deficiencies. What surprised him was the doctor's response. Not judgment or indifference, but genuine concern, followed by immediate treatment. The physician, an older man with gentle hands and wire-rimmed spectacles, administered vitamin injections and prescribed a diet plan designed to restore Marco's health. Through the interpreter, he explained that no prisoner would be assigned to work details until they had regained sufficient strength. Marco would spend 2 weeks in recuperation, eating 3 meals daily, resting, rebuilding his body before any labor was expected. Those 2 weeks at Fort Devens provided Marco's first real exposure to American abundance. The mess hall served food in quantities that seemed obscene to men accustomed to starvation rations. Breakfast brought eggs, actual eggs, not powdered substitutes, alongside bacon, toast with butter, oatmeal with brown sugar, coffee with real cream, and orange juice that tasted like sunshine. Marco ate slowly at first, afraid his stomach would rebel after months of near starvation. Other prisoners weren't so cautious and spent their first night sick from overeating, their bodies unable to process such richness after prolonged deprivation. The camp library held more books than Marco had seen outside of Verona's municipal collection. Newspapers arrived daily, not censored propaganda sheets, but actual journalism with photographs from around the world. Italian prisoners were allowed to read them, to understand the war's progress from perspectives other than fascist lies. Marco discovered that Sicily had fallen completely, that the Allies were pushing north through the Italian peninsula, that Mussolini had been deposed and arrested. The news should have filled him with despair for his country's defeat. Instead, he felt only relief that the madness might finally be ending. The recreation yard featured volleyball nets, bocce ball courts, and even a makeshift soccer field where prisoners organized daily matches. The guards watched from a distance, but didn't interfere unless games became too heated. Marco noticed that the guards were often older men, veterans of the First War, or those deemed unfit for frontline service. They performed their duties with professional detachment, neither cruel nor particularly friendly, just men doing a job they found tedious. One guard, Sergeant O'Brien, was a former baker from South Boston who had operated a small corner shop before his National Guard unit was activated. He struck up conversations with Marco through broken Italian and elaborate hand gestures, comparing techniques for sourdough starters and arguing the merits of different flour types with the passion of true craftsmen. These conversations, conducted partly in Italian, partly in English, and partly in the universal language of baking, provided Marco's first English lessons and planted seeds of friendship that transcended their official roles as prisoner and captor. By the end of his second week at Fort Devens, Marco had gained back 15 pounds. His cheeks had filled out, his eyes had lost their sunken quality, and his hands had stopped shaking from malnutrition. The medical officer declared him fit for work assignment and handed him papers that would determine his immediate future. He was being transferred to a labor camp in Michigan, assigned to agricultural support services with special notation of his baking skills. The name meant nothing to him. Camp Custer, near a town called Battle Creek. He'd never heard of Michigan, had no idea where it was in relation to Boston or New York or any of the American cities he'd learned about in school.
The transport left the following morning. The train journey to Michigan took 2 days, with an overnight stop in Buffalo, New York. Marco and 40 other Italian prisoners rode in a passenger car that had been modified with wire mesh over the windows, but otherwise remained comfortable with cushioned seats and working bathrooms. The guards rotated through the car every few hours, checking head counts, but mostly left the prisoners alone to watch America roll past the windows. The landscape transformed as they traveled west, the dense forests of New England giving way to farmland that stretched beyond imagination. Marco had grown up in northern Italy, where land was precious, where every square meter was cultivated, where families fought for generations over boundary disputes involving strips of earth barely wide enough for a man to walk. Here, single farms covered more land than his entire village. Barns rose like cathedrals, silos towered against the horizon, and mechanical harvesters worked fields with the efficiency of small armies. The other prisoners came from all over Italy, from sophisticated Romans who had served in headquarters units to Sicilian peasants who had been conscripted and shipped to Africa without understanding why they were fighting. Marco found himself drawn to a small group of northerners, men from Lombardy and Piedmont who spoke dialects similar to his Veronese. They shared stories of home, of families and friends, of the lives they had left behind when Mussolini's grand imperial adventure had dragged them into a war none of them wanted. Pietro Lombardi, a stonemason from Milan, described how his construction company had been building apartments when he was conscripted, how he'd left his wife 8 months pregnant with their first child. Alessandro Ricci, a mechanic from Turin, talked about his motorcycle shop and the racing bikes he'd been designing before the war interrupted everything. These men weren't soldiers by choice or conviction. They were craftsmen, workers, family men who had been swept up in fascist rhetoric and military conscription, who had fought because they had no choice, and who now found themselves prisoners in a country they'd been taught to despise but were discovering to be far different than expected. Camp Custer sprawled across hundreds of acres of Michigan countryside, a temporary city of wooden barracks that had been constructed in months to house thousands of prisoners. The camp sat just outside Battle Creek, a town that Marco would soon learn was famous for breakfast cereals, home to factories that produced cornflakes and other products he'd never heard of but would come to know well. The processing into Camp Custer followed the same efficient pattern as Fort Devens, though the facility was larger, more established, designed for long-term housing rather than temporary holding. The barracks featured wood stoves for heating, electric lights, and bunks with actual mattresses rather than straw ticks. Each building housed 40 men, with enough space that prisoners weren't sleeping on top of each other. The camp had been built by American standards for American soldiers, then converted for prisoner use without significant downgrade. This attention to basic human dignity, this provision of comfort even for enemies, continued to erode the foundations of everything Marco had been taught about his captors. The camp commander, Colonel William Harrison, addressed the new arrivals through an interpreter on their first morning. He was a career Army officer from Virginia, a man in his 50s with gray temples and a bearing that suggested competence rather than cruelty. His message was straightforward and delivered without theatrical threats or displays of power. You are prisoners of war under the protection of the Geneva Convention. You will be treated according to international law. You will work to support the American war effort, but you will be paid for your labor, housed properly, fed adequately, and given medical care as needed. Escape attempts will be punished, but not with violence. Cooperation will be rewarded with privileges. We are not your enemies anymore.
That war is over for you. Your enemy now is boredom, and we will help you fight that with work, education, and recreation. Marco found the speech remarkable, not for what it said, but for what it didn't say. No threats of retaliation, no promises of harsh discipline, no attempts to justify prisoner treatment through moral superiority or righteousness. Just practical statements of policy, delivered as simple facts. The work assignments came the following day. Marco's baking skills had been noted in his file, and he was summoned to meet with Lieutenant James Morrison, the camp's supply officer responsible for food services. Morrison was a former restaurant manager from Detroit who had been drafted and assigned to logistics based on his civilian experience. He spoke no Italian, but his enthusiasm for food transcended language barriers. The camp bakery, he explained through the interpreter, currently produced only basic breads for prisoner consumption. He wanted to expand production to supply local farmers who were working with prisoner labor crews, possibly even to sell goods to the civilian population to offset camp costs. Did Marco think he could handle increased production with limited equipment and whatever ingredients were available? Marco asked about flour supplies, yeast quality, oven capacity, and fuel availability. Morrison's answers revealed resources that seemed almost unlimited compared to what Marco had worked with in North Africa, where flour had been cut with sawdust and bread had been more weapon than food. Morrison walked him to the camp bakery, a large wooden building with brick ovens that had been constructed specifically for bread production. The facility was basic but functional, with work tables, mixing equipment, and storage areas. The ovens were American-made, not the sophisticated European designs Marco had trained on, but solid and reliable, with good heat distribution. Morrison handed him a clipboard with supply inventories and told him he had 2 weeks to develop production plans and train a crew. After that, he'd be expected to produce 500 loaves daily, more if possible. Any surplus production could be sold through camp administration, with small portions of profits going to prisoner accounts. For the first time since his capture, Marco felt something beyond mere survival. He felt purpose. The Italian prisoners assigned to Marco's bakery crew were an unlikely collection of personalities, united only by their imprisonment. None of them were trained bakers, but Morrison had selected men with relevant skills or experience. Giuseppe Romano had worked in his family's pasta shop in Naples, understanding fermentation and dough handling, even if he'd never made bread. Carlo Benedetti had been a chef in a Florence hotel before conscription, skilled at organization and high-volume food preparation. Angelo Moretti was simply a hard worker from Calabria, who had spent his life doing farm labor and was willing to learn anything. The fifth member was Salvatore Russo, a sullen young man from Palermo, who had been assigned to the bakery crew as punishment for fighting with another prisoner. Marco suspected Russo would be more problem than help, but orders were orders, and he would make the best of it. Their first day together in the bakery began with Marco explaining his philosophy of bread making, translated haltingly by Giuseppe, who spoke the best English among them. "Bread is alive," Marco told them.
The yeast is a living organism that must be treated with respect. You cannot rush it, you cannot force it. You can only create conditions where it can do its work. Temperature matters, timing matters, the feel of the dough matters. I will teach you techniques, but mostly I will teach you to pay attention, to listen to what the bread is telling you. Giuseppe's translation made Carlo laugh and comment that Marco sounded like a priest discussing communion. Marco smiled and replied that perhaps there was something sacred about bread, about transforming simple ingredients into sustenance that kept people alive. Even Salvatore seemed intrigued, despite his obvious desire to remain aloof and angry. The learning process consumed those first 2 weeks as Marco patiently demonstrated techniques while his crew practiced and failed and practiced again. Giuseppe proved the quickest study, his pasta-making experience translating well to bread dough. Carlo brought organizational skills that helped establish efficient workflows and production schedules. Angelo worked with the determination of someone grateful to have clean, indoor work instead of field labor. Even Salvatore gradually became engaged, his natural competitiveness driving him to master techniques faster than the others. Marco discovered that teaching focused his mind in ways that simple labor couldn't. That sharing knowledge accumulated over 20 years of baking gave him connection to his former life and identity beyond just being prisoner number 31579. The first production day arrived with Marco nervous in ways he hadn't been since his apprenticeship ended. They began work at 4 in the morning, the bakery warm from fires stoked in the ovens, flour dust dancing in lamplight as they mixed the first batches of dough. Marco moved between stations, checking consistency, correcting techniques, adjusting ratios based on how the dough felt under his hands. The formula he'd developed used standard American bread flour, commercial yeast, salt, sugar, and lard for shortening. Nothing fancy, no Italian traditions or special techniques, just honest bread designed to be reliable and satisfying. The first loaves emerged from the ovens 6 hours later, golden brown with crispy crusts and soft interiors that filled the bakery with aromas that made Marco's chest ache with homesickness. They had produced 467 loaves that first day, falling short of Morrison's 500 target, but exceeding what anyone had realistically expected from their first attempt. Lieutenant Morrison arrived that afternoon to inspect their production.
breaking open a loaf while it was still warm, tasting it with the concentration of someone who understood food. He chewed slowly, nodded, and turned to Marco with genuine approval. "This is good bread. Better than good. This tastes like something my grandmother would make." Marco understood enough English by now to catch the compliment, and he felt pride that had nothing to do with the war or his status as prisoner number 31579. He had made good bread in circumstances that could have excused mediocrity, had maintained his standards and his craft despite everything. Morrison authorized additional supplies and gave permission for surplus loaves to be distributed to prisoner work crews at local farms, with strong hint that civilian farmers might be interested in purchasing bread if quality remained high. Word spread through the camp about the bakery's products with surprising speed. Prisoners who had been eating institutional bread for months suddenly had access to fresh loaves that reminded them of home, of normal life before the war. Marco began receiving requests for special items, Italian-style breads that required different techniques and ingredients.
Could he make focaccia? What about grissini breadsticks? Someone from Sicily asked about pane casareccio, the rustic country bread his mother had made. Marco compiled a list and presented it to Morrison, expecting rejection. Instead, Morrison studied the requests and asked which ones could be made with available ingredients. They negotiated a compromise where Marco could experiment with specialty breads once per week, using a portion of his flour allocation to test recipes and techniques. Any successful products could be added to regular production if demand warranted. The arrangement marked a turning point in Marco's captivity because it transformed his work from mere labor into something approaching creative expression. He spent evenings sketching formulas, calculating ratios, planning production schedules that would allow specialty baking without compromising regular bread output. Giuseppe became his main assistant, learning quickly enough that Marco could trust him with increasingly complex tasks. Carlo took over inventory management and supply ordering, his restaurant experience making him a natural at logistics. Angelo handled the heavy work, moving flour sacks and tending fires with tireless efficiency. Even Salvatore found his niche maintaining equipment and troubleshooting mechanical problems with the mixers and ovens. They were becoming a team, united by craft and shared purpose, their prisoner status fading into background as they focused on creating something worthwhile. The autumn of 1943 brought harvest season, and with it, increased demand for bread as prisoner work crews dispersed across Michigan farmland to help bring in crops. Marco's bakery began supplying fresh bread to work details at over 30 farms, and civilian farmers started requesting the option to purchase loaves for their own families. Morrison established a system where farmers could order bread through camp administration, paying modest prices that provided small credits to prisoner accounts. Marco found himself baking not just for prisoners, but for American families. His bread appearing on dinner tables across southern Michigan, feeding people who should have been his enemies, but who were simply hungry workers appreciating good craft. The first request for specialty work came from an unlikely source. Father Anthony Russo, the Catholic priest who conducted services at the camp chapel, was planning a feast day celebration for Italian prisoners. He wanted traditional Italian breads for the occasion, whatever Marco could produce that would remind the men of home and better times. Marco seized the opportunity, planning a menu that would showcase different regional styles. He would make pane di semola from Durham flour for the Sicilians, macchetta rolls for the Milanese, pane sciocco, the unsalted bread of Tuscany, and his own Veronese pan biscotto, twice-baked bread that could be stored for weeks. The project required Morrison's approval because it meant diverting resources from regular production, but the lieutenant understood the psychological value of allowing prisoners to maintain cultural connections. He authorized special ingredient orders and gave Marco 2 days to prepare for the feast day celebration. The baking marathon began on a Thursday morning, with Giuseppe and Carlo arriving early to help with preparations.
They worked through the day and into the night, mixing doughs with different hydration levels and fermentation times, shaping loaves according to regional traditions, managing ovens to produce varying crust colors and textures. Angelo kept fires burning at precise temperatures, while Salvatore shuttled finished loaves to cooling racks and prepared pans for the next batches. Marco moved through the stages of production with intense focus, drawing on memories of his grandfather's teachings, recipes he'd learned as a child, techniques he'd refined over years of practice. This wasn't just bread. It was edible memory, physical manifestation of home and family, and everything the war had disrupted. The feast day celebration filled the camp's recreation hall with smells of Italy, with textures and flavors that transported prisoners beyond the Michigan prisoner camp.
Men held bread they hadn't tasted in years, recognizing the specific styles of their home regions, remembering mothers and grandmothers who had baked similar loaves. Marco watched from the side of the hall as prisoners wept while eating his bread, as tough combat veterans became emotional over something as simple as proper focaccia or correctly made grissini. Father Rousseau found him after the meal and gripped his shoulder with quiet intensity. "You have given these men more than bread today. You have given them dignity, memory, and hope." For a few hours, they were not prisoners, but human beings with culture and history worth preserving. Marco couldn't respond because his throat had closed with emotion, but he nodded, understanding. The success of the feast day bread led to regular requests for Italian specialties from both prisoners and, surprisingly, from camp personnel. Guards who had tasted the bread during the celebration asked if they could purchase loaves for their own families. Camp administrators wanted to know if Marco could supply bread for officer functions and official events. Within weeks, his bakery was operating essentially as a small business, producing standard loaves for prisoners and specialty breads for paying customers, with demand exceeding capacity. Morrison proposed expanding the operation, adding second-shift workers, upgrading equipment, possibly even constructing a larger facility. Marco found himself in the surreal position of discussing business plans and production targets with American officers, planning expansion of an enterprise that existed only because he was a prisoner of war. Winter arrived with Michigan snow that stunned Italian prisoners accustomed to Mediterranean climates. Marco had experienced cold in northern Italy, but nothing prepared him for the sustained brutality of Michigan winter, where temperatures plunged below zero and snow accumulated in depths that made movement difficult. The bakery became refuge, always warm from the ovens, filled with the comforting smells of baking bread, a place where frozen fingers could thaw and cold bodies could find warmth. Production actually increased during winter months because prisoners volunteered for bakery duty to escape the cold, and Marco trained additional crew members to handle the expanded workload. The Christmas season brought unexpected developments that would ultimately transform Marco's entire future, though he couldn't know it at the time. A local farmer named Robert Patterson, who had been purchasing bread for his work crews, appeared at the camp with his daughter in December to place a special order for the holiday. Patterson was a prosperous dairy farmer whose operation employed 6 prisoner work crews. His daughter, Catherine, was a schoolteacher in Battle Creek, home for Christmas vacation to help her father with year-end business. She spoke competent Italian, having studied the language in college, with dreams of eventually traveling to Europe. When she and Marco discussed the bread order, they slipped naturally into Italian, her careful textbook phrases meeting his rapid native speech in conversation that bridged their circumstances. Catherine asked about Marco's training, his family bakery in Verona, the techniques that made his bread distinctive. Marco found himself explaining his craft in detail, grateful to speak his own language with someone who genuinely wanted to understand rather than simply placing orders. Their conversation stretched beyond the business transaction into territory that felt dangerously close to friendship, to human connection that ignored the prisoner-civilian boundary.
When Catherine left with her father, promising to return after the holiday to pick up their order, Marco realized he'd been smiling for the first time in months. Catherine Patterson returned to Camp Custer 3 days after Christmas, this time alone, ostensibly to collect the bread order. She arrived mid-afternoon, when the bakery was between production runs, when Marco was cleaning work surfaces and planning the next day's schedule. They talked for over an hour, conversations that ranged far beyond baking into territory that felt simultaneously dangerous and necessary. He asked about her teaching, her students, what life was like in small-town Michigan. Neither acknowledged the absurdity of their situation, an Italian prisoner and an American schoolteacher finding common ground in the middle of a world war. When she finally left with her father's bread order, she mentioned casually that her family had a spare oven in their old summer kitchen that wasn't being used, and if Marco ever needed additional capacity for specialty orders, perhaps some arrangement could be made through proper channels. The suggestion hung in the air like promise or possibility, or perhaps both. The arrangement Catherine suggested materialized through official channels by late January. Colonel Harrison approved a program allowing skilled prisoners to work at civilian locations under guard supervision, provided the work supported war production or essential services. Marco found himself transported twice weekly to the Patterson farm, where the old summer kitchen had been converted into a small auxiliary bakery. The space was modest compared to the camp facility, with a single brick oven and limited work surfaces, but it offered something the camp bakery couldn't provide: privacy and creative freedom to experiment with techniques that required quiet concentration. Catherine often stopped by during these sessions, ostensibly to check on progress, but increasingly to engage in conversations that stretched far beyond professional necessity. She brought Italian poetry books borrowed from the college library, read verses aloud with careful pronunciation while Marco shaped dough and corrected her accent. He reciprocated by teaching her baking terminology, the specific Italian words for techniques that had no English equivalents. Their guard, Sergeant Miller, was a grandfather from Grand Rapids who spent most of his supervision time dozing in a chair by the door, apparently deciding that an Italian baker posed minimal security threat while making bread in a civilian kitchen. The spring of 1944 brought news from Europe that complicated Marco's internal landscape. Allied forces were advancing through Italy, liberating towns and villages as German resistance crumbled. Each communiqué carried the possibility that Verona might be freed, that his family might survive the war, that someday he might return home. Yet simultaneously, he found himself increasingly rooted in this strange Michigan existence, in the rhythm of baking and teaching, in conversations with Catherine that had evolved into something neither could quite name, but both recognized as significant. He existed in uncomfortable suspension between two lives, two futures, uncertain which he actually wanted. The Patterson family began inviting Marco to Sunday dinners after church, arrangements approved through proper channels, with Sergeant Miller in attendance. These meals revealed American domestic life in ways that camp existence couldn't capture. The farmhouse table overflowed with food prepared by Catherine and her mother, roasted chickens and fresh vegetables and pies that demonstrated the agricultural abundance Marco had witnessed but never fully experienced as a participant. Robert Patterson spoke about farming challenges and labor shortages, treating Marco's input on bread production as valuable business consultation rather than prisoner obligation. Catherine's younger brothers peppered him with questions about Italy and the war, their curiosity innocent of political judgment. Her mother, Maria Patterson, was herself the daughter of Italian immigrants, spoke dialect that mixed Calabrese and English, created connections across generational and national boundaries. These Sunday gatherings accumulated into a pattern that felt dangerously close to belonging, to being part of a family rather than merely a prisoner tolerated at their table. Marco found himself anticipating these meals with an intensity that troubled him. Counting days until the next Sunday, mentally rehearsing conversations he wanted to have with Catherine, the realization that he was developing feelings for his captor's daughter should have alarmed him, but instead it felt inevitable, as if their circumstances had been designed specifically to create this impossible connection. By summer, Marco's bakery operation had expanded beyond anything initially envisioned. He employed 12 Italian prisoners full-time, supplied bread to over 70 farms, served civilian customers throughout Battle Creek and surrounding communities, and generated profits that offset significant portions of camp food costs. Lieutenant Morrison had been promoted partly based on the bakery program's success, and he rewarded Marco with unprecedented freedoms. Permission to visit local mills to inspect flour quality, authorization to meet with civilian bakers to share techniques, even occasional unsupervised trips to Battle Creek proper, accompanied only by Sergeant Miller, who had become more companion than guard.
The war in Europe was reaching its conclusion through the summer and fall of 1944. Italy had switched sides, joining the Allies against Germany, transforming Italian prisoners from enemies into something more ambiguous. Marco and his fellow captives existed in legal limbo, technically still prisoners, but no longer quite enemies, waiting for bureaucratic decisions about their status and future. Some prisoners chose repatriation, eager to return home despite Italy's devastation. Others applied for permission to remain in America, seeking opportunities that war-shattered Italy couldn't provide. Marco found himself paralyzed by the choice, unable to commit to either direction, because both meant abandoning something essential. The decision crystallized on an October evening at the Patterson farm. Catherine had been teaching him English using her college textbooks, their lessons taking place in the summer kitchen where he'd been baking experimental sourdough variations. The lesson had dissolved into conversation about futures and possibilities, about what might happen when the war finally ended and prisoners were released. Marco had been describing his family bakery in Verona, the three-generation tradition he'd left behind, the expectation that he would return to continue that legacy. Catherine listened with an expression he couldn't quite interpret, sadness mixed with something else, resignation, perhaps, or acceptance of inevitable separation. Then she asked the question that changed everything. "But is that what you want, Marco? To go back to what was? Or do you want to build something new?" He had no immediate answer because no one had ever asked him what he wanted, only what he was obligated to do. His silence stretched uncomfortably until Catherine stood and walked to the window, her back to him as she spoke quietly. "My father is getting older, considering retirement from active farming. He's been thinking about converting some of the property to other uses, maybe establishing a proper commercial bakery to supply the region. He would need an experienced baker to manage such an operation, someone who understands the craft and the business. I told him I knew someone who might be interested." Marco understood what she was offering, not just a job, but a future. A life in America with her family, with her. The implications terrified and thrilled him in equal measure. He would be abandoning his family legacy, turning his back on 3 generations of Tessari bakers, choosing America over Italy, Catherine over duty. Yet he also recognized that his old life was gone, regardless of his choice, that war had already destroyed whatever future he'd imagined before his capture. The question wasn't whether he could return to what was, but whether he had courage to embrace what might be. The war ended officially in May 1945 with Germany's surrender. Italian prisoner repatriation began that summer, though the process moved slowly through bureaucratic complications. Marco applied for permission to remain in the United States, citing job offers and sponsor commitments from the Patterson family. His application joined thousands of others from prisoners who had discovered that America offered opportunities their devastated home countries couldn't match. The approval came through in December 1945, granting Marco legal residency status and releasing him from prisoner designation.
He walked out of Camp Custer on Christmas Eve, no longer a prisoner but not quite a citizen, existing in that ambiguous space between identities. Robert Patterson had kept his word about the bakery. Through the winter and spring of 1946, they converted one of the farm's outbuildings into a proper commercial facility with modern ovens, professional equipment, and space for significant production. Marco invested every dollar of his accumulated prisoner wages and bakery profits into the venture, becoming a partner rather than merely an employee. They named it Patterson and Tessari Bakery, a partnership that acknowledged both American opportunity and Italian craft. The grand opening in June 1946 drew crowds that exceeded anything Marco had imagined, people who had been buying his bread for 2 years now arriving to support his legitimate business venture. Catherine had continued teaching but spent summers helping establish the bakery's administrative systems. Their relationship had evolved through the ambiguity of his prisoner status into something that could finally be acknowledged openly. Marco proposed in August 1946 on the same summer kitchen porch where they'd had their first real conversation, offering a ring he'd purchased with his first profits as a free businessman. They married that November in a Catholic ceremony that brought together the Italian prisoner community, the Patterson family, former camp personnel, and hundreds of customers who had come to know Marco through his bread. The bakery prospered through the post-war years as Michigan's economy boomed. Marco and Catherine raised 4 children, each learning the craft that had brought their father to America. Giuseppe, Carlo, and Angelo all remained in Michigan, establishing their own businesses and families, becoming part of the immigrant success story that defined post-war America. Even Salvatore eventually returned after a difficult period in Italy, finding that Marco's bakery offered better opportunities than his devastated homeland. The old crew reunited, now as business partners and friends rather than prisoners united by circumstance. Marco never returned to Italy, though he maintained correspondence with surviving family members and sent money to help rebuild the Verona bakery that his cousins now operated. His children visited Italy as adults, connecting with relatives and experiencing the culture their father had left behind. But Marco's life remained rooted in Michigan, in the community that had transformed him from enemy prisoner into valued citizen, in the family he'd built with Catherine, in the daily rhythm of baking bread that connected past and present. The Patterson and Tessari Bakery operated for 42 years until Marco's retirement in 1988. By then, it employed over 30 people, supplied restaurants and stores throughout southern Michigan, and had become a regional institution known for quality that reflected its founders' uncompromising standards. Marco passed away in 1995 at age 76, surrounded by children and grandchildren whose existence represented the most profound victory of all. Life built from catastrophe, family created from conflict, home discovered in the most unlikely circumstances. His story stands as testament to transformation's possibility, to the reality that enemies can become friends, that captivity can lead to freedom, that the most profound changes often emerge from the most unexpected sources. Sometimes the greatest victories aren't won on battlefields, but in bakeries, not through conquest, but through craft, not by destroying enemies, but by discovering their humanity over warm bread and patient conversation. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.